How did authenticity in reality TV start and when did it die?
The way I talk about reality TV in this book is I call it dirty documentary. And what I basically describe it as is when somebody takes what people think of as the highbrow discipline of cinema verite documentary, which is just when you take a camera and you just are patient and watch, and eventually the truth will emerge. That's the sort of purest version of cinema verite. And then you mix it up with something more commercial, more serialized that you can show on TV, that's a format that you can repeat again and again, and that puts pressure on the people inside it. And this can be a game show, it can be a soap opera, it can be a real combination of things like on Survivor. But the goal is that you have real people, and they're having authentic reactions, but the authentic reactions are happening under some kind of complicated outside pressure, and the cameras are there to capture them. And so this is a large genre. There are many, many different versions of this. But I will say that the freak out over authenticity that happened on the first season of The Real World was unlike anything else that happened in reality TV. There are many shows where people were concerned about wanting things to be real, or alternately about wanting things to be dramatic and doing that by any means necessary, including deceptive editing. But The Real World, because of when it was made in the early 90s, was very much a pure Gen X show. And that was not only true of the cast of the first season of The Real World, like, Julie and Kevin and Heather and like that whole crew that if you watch the show, you know the people, but also the crew of the show, who were a bunch of young MTV employees who weren't that much older than the cast, and were also very concerned about the purity of the experiment that they were doing and about not messing with it. And there was a big debate that broke out on that show between the show's creators, John Murray and Mary Ellis Bunham, and the cast and the crew about what Mary Ellis Bunham wanted to do, which she called throwing pebbles in the pond, which is basically doing small disruptions, like sending somebody out on a fake date, or putting a book that had a sexy picture of Eric Nees was the model on the show, the hot guy on the show. And he had appeared in a nude photo. And so they put the book with the photo in the room to try to get a reaction. When the cast and the crew realized what they were doing, people were outraged. And I at one point, I talk about this as a philosophy as outdated as the Shakers. It was a very pure notion of you can't do anything to manipulate people. We are just trying to capture the truth. And in one way, there's something very beautiful about that, but it was extremely short-lived. And after this rebellion on the part of the cast, which I have to say, to her credit, the executive from MTV ended up taking the side of the cast. And she said, there can't be that much producer intervention into the show. I think that changed a lot on The Real World, and then Road Rules, and then The Challenge over time. But it did establish this initial idea of, however contrived the setting is, it can't be scripted, but also it can't be totally manipulated. I mean, I don't want to be naive about this. I mean, many, many shows have enormous amounts of manipulation. But I have to say, when you investigate that little moment on The Real World, I think that it's just one of those very pure things that kind of resonates with the larger history of debates over how much you're allowed to interfere and how much you're allowed to fake things. And, in more recent years, I think people understand that a lot of reality is essentially a collaboration between cast and crew where they're faking and acting out sort of soap opera-y plots. And that's true. But I will say the origins of the genre are not necessarily in people scripting their own conflicts. It is somewhat in people capturing conflicts. The cast rebelling against the crew did not just happen on The Real World. It happened again and again on the shows that I write about in the book. And I think it's one of the most interesting parts of the story is I think this tension between the cast that feels controlled by the field producers and the cameramen and the show creators. And the whole thing is always sort of a collaboration between both sides, that the viewers can't see one side of it. They can only see the cast. But yeah, there are several other shows, and we could talk about that, where the cast almost stopped the show. That happened on Big Brother, happened in a different way on Survivor. There are all these attempts for casts to sort of organize against the crew and sometimes actually change the rules as they're being made. And I think it's one of the more interesting parts of the story. And more recently, this goes way beyond the book, but I just wrote this piece about Love is Blind, the dating show. And that was more about the labor issues and about the legal issues on reality TV. But this is a more recent thing, but I feel like this is this comes out of that past history of reality cast members trying to organize against crews. There's actually a real attempt to create some sort of unionization or other kind of solidarity among reality cast members. And I think it's a long time coming. And I think it's worth looking at the history of the genre to understand how meaningful that is, because it's a vulnerable group of people, however much people may want to judge them.